In this video, I am going to quickly cover some basics for improving the performance of your application. So many of you probably experienced a little bit of a lag or degradation in performance of the headset as you started to add more and more models to the environment. And in part because the more things you add, obviously, the more that needs to be rendered. And so we need to do some things to optimize our settings in order to handle all of those additional objects and also some different features that we can enable to streamline how those objects are rendered. So let's get started by quickly looking at our current settings for the game. All right. So when you come into project settings, we've been in here before to mess with things like the XR plugin management. You will find a setting called quality. And what you can see here is a number of different options mapped to the different platforms that we can build to. So we have performant, balanced, high fidelity, and then one here that you probably won't have called Quest. So I'm going to delete that real quick just so that you can get a sense of how this works. So you can see that like if you're running on a PC, you can afford to set this setting to high fidelity by default. And then if you're running on Android, the default is balanced, and that's because you want your game to still look reasonably good, but perform well. Um, but at the end of the day, it's up to you which of these you might want to leverage for your particular build. Maybe you're doing an activity or task or use case that the fidelity of the things you're interacting with isn't super important. And maybe you want to do performant because maybe having really good low latency interactions is more important than high fidelity visuals. But for most of us, I think balance is going to be the right choice. And if we want, we can actually, rather than mess with the default settings here on these different levels, we can actually add our own quality level. So I hit the add button, and that provides me this new level that I'm going to just call Quest. And so once I do that, I can now come up here and make some decisions about what I want its default settings to be. So in this case, I'm going to select both this quality setting for the Android platform and for the PC, and I'm going to make how do I do this? Turn off. Forget how you make it the default, but I think there's a way to do that. So we're going to go ahead and check that off for right now, and we will check this off for right now. And so now, anytime I build on my Quest setting, then we'll be using this set of settings in here. All right. So now let's take a quick look at what the configuration currently is. So when we look at the current configuration, you can see it's actually set to high fidelity. So that would be as if no different than if we were running on this quality level. So what we want to do is we want to click on this box, and we want to actually choose URP balanced, again, because this will hopefully give us the best of both worlds, like no lag but still good visuals. Um, we'll go ahead and leave this real-time reflection probe setting on. I'll talk a little bit more about reflection probes when we get into the topic of lighting. So just leave that for now. The rest of this you can pretty much leave alone. Make sure that your setting is set to per texture for this anisotropic textures. And then you pretty much leave the rest of this alone. And then make sure that you have it set to distance shadow mask. This will allow the shadows to be controlled based on the distance they are away from the player. And yep, I think the rest of that is pretty good. It's good to go. So when we selected this URP balanced setting here, this is actually referencing something in our in our assets folder. So if we come down to our assets folder and we look for settings, you'll see that you'll find that URP balance setting in here and matches to this. So go ahead and close project settings, and now we're going to come into the URP balance setting, and we're going to just double check and make sure that this is configured the way that we want. So even though it says URP balanced, in theory you could actually manipulate all of these settings to create something that's much more high fidelity than necessary. So we got to make some smart choices about what balanced really means. So what we're going to do is we're just going to quickly look through. I'm not going to explain all of these different settings, but I'll stop on a few of them just to give you a sense of what you should kind of care about. So we don't need things like depth texture, opaque texture. These try to handle um, the shaders for different items in different ways. Um, you know, if you're getting into the weeds on shaders and things like that for your game, maybe you might want to investigate these settings some more. But for the most part, I don't think we need these. Um, we can leave terrain holes on. We want to make sure HDR is turned off. The Quest 2 is not a high dynamic range device, so we don't want to include that. The most important setting in here is the anti-aliasing, and you'll see that you have a couple of different options in here. Yours may be set to disabled by default. So what we really want to do is we want to pick an anti-aliasing setting, probably somewhere in the middle. Again, balance is sort of trying to split the difference. And what this does is it tries to smooth out the edges of objects, right? So if I basically turn it off, all of my objects will have this very jaggedy looking line. If I crank it up, most of these things will become relatively smooth. Again, you can play around with this for your individual game. Some people 8 times might work just fine and not cause any lag. Other people, if you've got a really overly detailed world, 4 might even be pushing it. But go ahead and set it to 4 for now. That should probably be reasonably good, and we'll kind of go from there. And then the next thing we can do is look at the lighting settings, and this one's going to have probably the biggest impact on your performance. Lighting is just really an expensive process, and casting shadows and doing all of that causes a lot of computation for the system, especially when you're using real-time lighting. We'll talk about non-real-time lighting very briefly in class, but depending on where you're getting your assets from, depending on the quality of those assets, honestly, real-time lighting is just a little bit easier to do than non-real-time. But non-real-time lighting is actually less expensive, so performance-wise, non-real-time lighting is probably the right choice. But again, we'll cover that in a later topic. So we do want to cast shadows, but we want to manipulate the shadow resolution. We don't really want it super high. 512 is probably sufficient for most people in most cases, just to give you enough shadow. Again, up to you. You can kind of pick, but I probably wouldn't go anything higher than 1024. So I'm going to leave mine at 512 because again, I want to be able to add as much stuff to my world without necessarily dropping my performance. And I can always come back and change it if I find that I have the ability to do that. We want lights on a per pixel. The per object limit should be set to 2. We do want to cast shadows, and that shadow atlas resolution, again, same kind of thing. We probably don't want to go any higher than 1024. So just pick, whichever one you feel like works best for you. You honestly, if you really want, you can actually drop shadows. Shadows definitely add to the immersion and also people's perception of depth. But it's not always something that's super necessary or useful depending on the type of use case that you have. Now, these last couple settings, same thing. This is sort of a range of different resolutions. I use just sort of base 64 units, so 128, 256, 512, just kind of keeping it in nice little increments like that, sort of doubling each time. And then you can also see that there is an atlas resolution for cookieing. So basically, it remembers, the shadows for different static objects. Again, kind of pick your poison. I'm going to actually bump that up to 512 across the board. We don't need the probe blending or box projection because we're probably only going to put one reflection probe in. If you get really into the lighting effects in your game, you can do a little more research on what these settings do and whether they're useful or not. The big thing here on settings-wise that'll help improve performance for you is setting this max distance for shadows. So this distance is the same as all of the other distances in Unity, is based on 1 meter. So basically what I'm telling the system is anything that's 10 meters away from the player, don't try to render the shadow for that. And if you think about like a scene like what I have here, right, like in an interior factory scene, like that wall is probably only like 4 or 5 meters from me. So if I set this to 10, anything in this room will have an appropriate shadow based on that distance. Now when I go into the outside portion of my factory, out into the open world, that's where maybe the distance piece can become a little bit of a hindrance, because maybe there are things within your field of view that are at or just beyond that 10 meters where maybe you would expect to see a shadow. But again, that's a trade-off that you can kind of deal with as on a case-by-case basis. So I would, if you have an indoor scene, set it to a 10. If you have an outdoor scene, probably 20 is probably a safe bet in terms of performance, and then also having the shadow show up in a reasonably good place. Let's see. The other option in here that you might want to consider is whether or not you want soft shadows. And I think saying yes to this allows the system to sort of manage the quality of your shadows. Again, you can basically turn off soft shadows, so that would be like hard shadows are like, think like a really solid just representation of a shadow, whereas soft shadows are more like a gradient, right? You would sort of see the shadow sort of dissipate out as you might expect it to do. So I usually leave that on, but I usually set it to medium or low. And then the rest of this we can leave as is. So that is sort of step one, right? This is the baseline level of what you can do to sort of improve your performance on your application and hopefully reduce lag. Outside of that, there are some other tricks that we can do, short of actually changing the number of objects you have in your game and the quality of those objects. Part of the reason I suggested using low poly objects is because they have less polygons, they're easier to render. They may not look as nice, but they work much better on the Quest than super high fidelity, high resolution objects. So we'll take one more second here, and we will look at another feature that can sort of trick the system into rendering less objects at a given time. So when you first build your application, Unity is trying to render and anticipate basically building everything that you have in your world. And it does a little bit of what's called occlusion culling naturally, but we want to have a little more control over that. So what we're going to do is we're going to come over here to Window, and then we're going to go down to Rendering. We're going to go to Occlusion Culling, and that'll open up probably like a little dialogue, a little window that looks something like this, right? What I would do is go ahead and grab that tab and just drag it over towards your inspector panel. It's a lot easier to have it just locked in here than it is floating around on your screen. And when you first open occlusion culling, it's going to look more like this. After we take the next few steps, it will end up looking something like this. And what occlusion culling does is it allows you to set some parameters about how far away objects are treated by the renderer, including objects that may have holes in them, like a wall with a door or a window or things like that. And essentially what we're trying to tell the system is, hey, based on the size of the object, if something's behind it, go ahead and don't render that thing, right? So imagine I put a box in this room and it was placed in front of these pallets, right? Notionally, those pallets would be obscured by some big box, right? So I put the big, huge box in my field of view. I can't see past the box to those pallets. if I can't see past the box to those palettes, then there's no reason for the system to try and render those. Um, so essentially what you want to do is you want to set this smallest occluder to, something relatively small, right? So like 0.1 meter is like, um, you know, maybe an object a little bit bigger than, your hands or something like that. It's going to be a small item. But you want small items to even, sort of limit what's being rendered behind them. And then same thing with like the smallest hole, right? Like this doorway is, probably like, you know, uh, probably at that, 0.25 meters sort of height and width in terms of its size. Um, and so then what we're going to do is we're just going to hit bake. When we hit bake, it'll take a few minutes, but the system will begin to create this sort of giant grid map of your environment, and the grid map essentially is mapping out all of the different objects that live inside this grid, and then making a determination about, like, well, if I'm in, this grid square, what things should be turned on or off. And in fact, when you play your game, let me see if I can get this to work. I think you can actually see the grid and how it's being activated um, when you're actually like in the game, right? So if I turn back to scene and go to XR origin, um, should be seeing some objects getting cold from the scene. Let's see here if I can get this to work. Well, actually, I may not have that many objects to where that culling is doing too much, but in your case, as you move your headset around, you might see different objects start to disappear based on the settings you choose. So, this is something that again is maybe a nice to have. It may not be required, but if you have a really complex scene, maybe worth doing. Now, if we're going to use the occlusion culling, there may still be some additional steps that you need to um, use so you can, kind of manipulate like specific objects, renderers, or occlusion areas. I definitely suggest doing some research on this feature. I haven't really dove in too deep on it, but I do know that by having it on and baking the scene, I saw an improvement in performance in my system. So even if you don't see something happening in the scene view, trust that it is definitely trying to do some stuff in the game view. And in fact, if you come back over to your main camera, you'll see this setting for occlusion culling. So by manipulating those settings, you're helping the system better understand what you want occluded or not occluded. And again, that'll help hopefully speed up your overall performance. All right, so I'm going to stop the video there. Hopefully that's helpful, and hopefully by following along and implementing some of that, you see some improvements in the quality of your gameplay. And if not, that's where you may want to just start doing some independent research to see if there's a technique or set of settings that maybe I didn't cover that can maybe give you a little bit better performance. All right, good luck.